to finish today and be able to wrap up Ecclesiastes and be in a place to think about Ecclesiastes in relation to the gospel and Ecclesiastes for us as pastors. I think what we're going to do, I want to look at one section in the middle in chapter 5, and then we'll go to the end and we'll read the ending. But let's turn now, let's go to chapter 5. This is in what we might call the first instruction complex or instruction unit. Somebody read for us 5:1 through 7, and then we'll talk about the different mood and how this speaks to us in light of what we said before. What do you notice right off the bat that's different about this than the sections we've looked at before? Yeah, you notice how many times he's making commands. Guard your steps. Do not vow. Be not rash. When you vow. It's a different mood. And while Ecclesiastes is hard to outline, that's a good general guide for the movement through the book. This back and forth between I saw, I set my heart, and commands. Do this, don't do this. That's a good way that will get us roughly through the structure of the book. Now then, in this section where he's making, giving commands, speaking and instructing us, what's the message? What is he condemning and what is he calling us to? What kinds of things is he against, or kinds of people? A fool. Yeah, you see that? So in that question of how does wisdom, folly, those kind of language, how does it relate across books from Proverbs to Ecclesiastes? This, while there's some differences to Proverbs, it also sounds similar to Proverbs, doesn't it? Some people will read Ecclesiastes and say he is against wisdom, but is he for fools? No, not at all. He is clearly warning us there is a foolish way to approach God that is characterized by too many words. What does he say is better? Now this is subtle, but what do you think he's implying we should listen to? When you go to the house of God and listen, what is it that you should be listening to? Yeah, the Lord and the Scriptures. So even though he's not, again, there are some who read Ecclesiastes and see Kohelet as a skeptic who's rejecting the tradition of Israel, who's standing outside, who's maybe not even a believer. That doesn't fit with what he's saying. When he is implying, he is skeptical about fools, and he knows there's much ways to be a foolish person who claims to be obeying the Lord. But what he's commanding is draw near to the house of God, don't speak, listen, which is very consistent with the rest of the Old Testament about the posture we're to have before God, isn't it? Humble and contrite and trembling at his word. It's not far away from what he's describing here, is it? What else do you see in there? What are the other things he is instructing us to turn away from? Let your words be few. You can see how those things are kind of related. The person who's babbling, speaking much in the presence of God, making many boasts to God or promises to God, he's saying that's foolish. God is in the heavens, you are on the earth. Be silent, listen, and be obedient toward the Lord. Which leads to, how does he end it? What is our posture supposed to be towards the Lord? Now again, we've said enough, I think, that we're clear that's not the trembling, cringing fear that says, I believe God's going to reject me. That's the respect and awe and reverence that acknowledges God is God and I am not. Which is not just an Old Testament theme, that's also a New Testament theme. Our God is a consuming fire. We don't have to fear and turn away from him. That's what, when 1 John says perfect love casts out fear. It's the fear of judgment, that we don't have to have that. But that doesn't mean we treat God as though he's a peer on our level, a buddy. He is in the heavens. He is God. God is the one whom we must fear. So just from reading this kind of middle section here, does this seem consistent with what Kohelet has said before and the kinds of things he's been observing in the previous section? Is he contradicting himself, or does this seem fairly consistent? He's not just repeating himself verbatim, the same words, the same thing. He's applying it, but it's in continuity with what he's been saying before. That's important because when you read some commentators, they kind of chop him up into pieces and see, well, he's not consistent. He says one thing here and one thing here. He's challenging, but he's definitely consistent. Does that make sense? All right, for time's sake, let's flip. We have to skip much in the middle of the book. There are sections as we go on. One of the reasons that I think, I'll say it this way. One of the observations as you read through the book is that all the sections become shorter. He goes back and forth more regularly between observation and instruction. Whereas in the beginning we had an observation unit that goes all the way from that poem in chapter 1 through to the end of chapter 3, actually even into chapter 4, he gets shorter and shorter as he goes on, partly because he is making his point. He's teaching us to think of life the way he sees it, life under the sun, life under God's judgment, so he can alternate back and forth a little more quickly. He'll also, just a subtle detail that I think confirms the way that there's a unified message, early on, he'll make an observation and say, this too is hevel. As we get to the second half of the book, he'll actually describe someone's life as his hevel life. All this is his hevel. It's like the more he gets on, he says, I've already defined for you what I mean by this. If you want to know the meaning of the term, it's this kind of life in which pleasure is vain, in which wealth cannot secure for you. We didn't talk about it. Chapter 4, he says, in which even a wise man dies the same death as a fool. That's hevel. It's a world in which you cannot escape this crookedness of the world that God has put in there. But along with that, he says over and over again, it is better that you eat and take joy and have delight. Chapter 8, one of my favorite statements, it is in 8:15. And I commend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. So back and forth, this description of life really is like this, and yet when you submit to that and receive that and seek the power from God to enjoy life under the sun, it will be given to you. He can commend joy. I love that phrase. Here's what's good for you. I commend to you joy. Not joy that escapes this world and takes you out from under the judgment of God, but joy received from the hand of God. That's all the body of the book. He'll also start using Proverbs. You see, chapter 7 changes to a long section of Proverbs. They're challenging. Some of them are clear, others are not. It is not quite as clear what exactly he is saying. But he uses the forms of wisdom that we've already seen in Proverbs to teach his point over and over. And then we get finally to the last sections of the book. So let's turn there, chapter 11, and let's look at briefly at the last instructional unit, and then the final poem and the end of the book. Someone read for us, let's do verses 1 through 6 of chapter 11. So there's a little bit more of the instruction, but we've got the main sections of it there. What's he commending here? And remember, this is the end of his book. So after a book in which he has challenged us by the ways he thinks about the meaning and purpose of life, his final instructions here? What's he saying? Take verses 1 through 4 first. What are they commending? Yeah, invest, work. So if we think Kohelet is a skeptic who thinks that life has no point, then why would he get here to the end and say, cast your bread upon the waters, give a portion, be generous, work hard? This is again where you can't categorize him easily. He doesn't want you to think that your work will change the crookedness that the Lord has placed upon the world. But that doesn't mean you then become a person who's timid, fearful, who holds back, who never attempts anything. In fact, look what he says in verse 6. How does verse 6 relate to that? This command to be generous, to work, to invest. What does verse 6 add to that picture? Isn't that somewhat a surprising conclusion from someone who has told us that there is no gain in our toil? He says before that he uses the picture of the development of a child in the womb. And this is especially before the days of ultrasound, but even now, there is a mystery to how God develops a child in the womb. And he says, just like you don't know that, you don't know the work of God. But instead of saying, all right, so don't do anything, he turns around and says, work hard, because you don't know what will prosper. Let's put it in pastoral terms. If you stand in the pulpit thinking every sermon I preach will always bear immediate good fruit, and the people who hear it will respond and believe the gospel and be changed, you'll be discouraged. There will be people who hear your sermons over and over again and then go out and sin in exactly the ways you've warned them from the scriptures. Don't do that. There will be people who hear your gospel call over and over again and will still reject it and end up in hell. But the conclusion is not, don't bother preaching a sermon. The conclusion is preach because you don't know. Preach, labor, because it is not given to us to know what will come after us. That's a surprising conclusion if we think he's a skeptic or a pessimist, isn't it? But it's a freeing conclusion if we accept that God is in control and we are not. Does that make sense? See where he's going? What else? Other thoughts from that section? Anything that stands out from this last sort of instructional unit? Let's turn and we'll look at the final unit, which there's the transition between chapter 11 and chapter 12 is not a sharp transition. He's making his final instructions. 12:1 is another command. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. And then he switches into something that the ESV doesn't print it as poetry, but the language is so elevated and there's so much imagery that I think it's best to read this last section, beginning in the second part of 12:1, as a poem. And it's a challenging one. But someone read for us. Let's just read 12:1 through 7. And we'll grapple with all that he's saying here. That's a challenging section, isn't it, to know exactly what he means. You notice by the time we get to verse 7, that's kind of a key clue. Verse 7 is more clear than some of the other details. What does verse 7 hint that this poem is speaking about? Yeah, death. Is that what you're going to say, Brian? Yep. In what other parts of the Old Testament does verse 7 remind you of? Yeah, he is echoing Genesis 3 language. So that's a key to help us understand what's going on earlier. No one has a fully adequate explanation for every one of the images that he used. In fact, I have to read this to you because this cracks me up every time I see it. So in verse 5, when it says, they are afraid of what is high and terror is in the way, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along. The footnote, this is a Reader's Hebrew Bible, which means that it has a footnote and it shows you the vocabulary for rare words. For that word for grasshopper, here's what it says. The list it gives, it says it's uncertain, and then it says hip, penis, ankle, early summertime, and grasshopper. Those are the possibilities. I conclude if your list of possible definitions have all of those words in it, you don't have a clue what this word means. Body parts, grasshopper, might as well just throw our hands up and say, I'm not really sure what this word means. Some see this as reference to the failing body and even the way that sexual desire wanes and fails at the end of life. But then you read other parts of it and that doesn't fit with that either. I just have to laugh every time I look down at my footnote there and think, I have no idea what that word means, and I don't think the editors of my Hebrew Bible know what that word means either. But the net effect, so when we don't know what the individual words mean, and there are places in the Bible, especially in Hebrew, because it's a language that spans such a longer period of time, we have less examples of it to compare, like with Greek. The net effect, what's the net picture seem to be? It's about death, and how's he wanting us to think about life in light of that? What's that? Yes, right, because that's where he ends with. However, meaningless and worthless, or what kind of images, especially look at verse 6. What kind of pictures are those? What kind of things is he describing in verse 6? An aged person, right, but even think of the imagery that he uses. Is it a description of worthless things or valuable things? Valuable, but what else? What's the other characteristic? They're valuable, but what else? They're broken or easily broken. Yep. Yeah. That's part of how he's teaching us to think about life. He's not, you're right that he says they're vanity of vanities. That's where he's going. But not if we take that to mean human life is worthless. Rather, there's a sense in which he wants us to see life is a precious gift and life will end, which is a profound thought. There's one, I think I have this quote in there. One commentator puts this really, really well. Derek Kidner again. He says at the beginning and end of this passage, this is on page 18 in your outline. At the beginning and end of this passage, he writes directly, without metaphors. The evil days come, years draw near, that's the beginning, and then the Spirit returns. He cites those, and then he says, but between these points there is a profusion of images, some of which will conjure up with utmost vividness some aspect of aging or dying, while others tease us by allusions that at this distance we can scarcely catch. In other words, is it a grasshopper, a penis, a hip, an ankle? I don't know. You won't be able to catch it, but the point is not to, moving down to the next paragraph, the point is not to make us think and go down rabbit trails trying to figure it out. tempting us to treat this graceful poem, he says, like a labored cryptogram. That means a code that we have to finish or figure out, or force every detail into a rigid scheme. What he says, then a little bit lower, commenting on verse 6, here's what he says. The pictures of verse 6 capture the beauty and fragility of the human frame. A masterpiece is delicately wrought as any work of art, yet as breakable as a piece of earthenware, and as useless in the end as a broken wheel. The first half of this verse seems to portray a golden lamp suspended by a silver chain. It'll only take the snapping of a link to let it fall and be spoiled. And if this seems too finely drawn a picture of our familiar selves, it is balanced by the scene at the deserted well, a pitcher and a wheel at the end, easily broken, in other words. He said, they speak of the transience of the simplest, most basic things we do. A line that stuck with me. There will be a last time for every familiar journey, for every routine job. There will come a last time when you do the ordinary things of life. Ecclesiastes wants you to think about that and consider, and not conclude life is valueless, but conclude life is fragile. You see how that poem is ending on this? It's a sober note. Does that sound inconsistent with the way he's thought about life before? It's a summary of how he's teaching us to think about life in a hevel world under the sun, right? Does that make sense? Especially after reading that last sentence. There's times when sentences just stick with you. That description, a last time for every familiar journey, every routine job, all the ordinary parts of life, there will come a last time for those. So that then leads us to think, what is the purpose of life? If it is beautiful and yet fragile, how does he want us to think about it? Verse 8 is the first part of the clue. What does he say in verse 8? What's he repeat? Yeah, his theme. Life is vanity. Not life is worthless, but life is hevel. It is all that he has been teaching us to see about life. This is the kind of life we live. And then, someone read for us the end, 9 through 14. Let's take that last section. So after we've had the poem that teaches us, summarizing many of the things he said, teaching us to see life both as precious and fragile and coming to an end, then the repeated theme, life is vanity, life is hevel. Now, look at how these last three, in my Bible, I think the ESV probably breaks it up. It's 3 paragraphs, 9 and 10, 11 and 12, 13 and 14. Is that the same way it's laid out? So let's take them paragraph at a time. What's the effect of verses 9 and 10? So it's transition now to speaking about Kohelet, or about the preacher. What do you think he wants us to know about this man who's written this book? I heard someone say shepherd. It's in the next paragraph, but you're right. You're reading back and forth, and they're meant to be read together. But before we get to the shepherd part, is this a commendation of the preacher? He is wise. He taught the people knowledge. He is someone, remember how we talked about wisdom being both something that's spoken in Proverbs, but also something that is written down in forms that take care to impart truth. He's that kind of person. One commentator calls verse 10, it should be the patron verse for every writer. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he found words of truth. He labors hard to use the right word, to use a word that brings delight and imparts truth. So it's a commendation of the preacher. Does that make sense? I say that because there's some who are going to read these last, 9, 10, 11, 12, these last 6 verses and say that the point is to condemn the preacher. And they say that these verses are saying that the preacher sought to find words of delight, that the implication be, we should read that, he tried to do this, but he didn't actually. I just think that's being far too suspicious of the passage. I think what it is saying is this man writes carefully. He is giving himself to imparting truth. And he says to the people. Remember back to that picture of him gathering the people and passing on truth to them. It's a commendation of the preacher. We in agreement of that? Does that make sense? So then, 11 and 12. What's the point here? Where do these words of the wise come from? How do you interpret that? What do you think that means? The king, okay. I think that's part of the message. Why one shepherd, though? I think the combination of one and shepherd, which is, it's the word for the number one, so it occurs regularly, but the way it appears here seems to be an echo of the Lord your God. The Lord is one. It's the same word, echad. The Lord is one. There is one shepherd. It seems to be pointing, which is not in contradiction to it being the king. It seems to be the royal function of the ultimate shepherd of Israel, which is a link that points us to Jesus. Does that make sense? And it's the first place that shepherd imagery is used. But remember how many times in the Old Testament the king is described as a shepherd and God is described as a shepherd. So saying it's the king and saying it's God are actually both unpacking part of that metaphor of one shepherd. So when he says that, do you think we should be suspicious of what Kohelet says or receive it? I am belaboring this point because even some evangelical commentators will read the whole book and then get here and say, this is the part that we're supposed to recognize, and the whole rest is to teach you the danger of speculating about the meaning of life apart from God. That drives me crazy. I don't think that is reading Kohelet carefully. And I think part of the problem is that some of those commentators don't want to acknowledge that there are parts of life that don't make sense. They try to explain everything. I'm speculating here, and I could be passing judgment on brothers, but I'll say it anyway, and if I need to confess, I'll confess later. I think some of those commentators need to be a pastor for 10, 15, 20 years and see the kinds of things that Kohelet sees and wants us to see about the parts of life that don't make sense. And not conclude, if I just apply my brain a little harder, I can make sense of it, but recognize, no, there's a part of life we're supposed to say, that's hevel. I don't get it. It doesn't make sense to me. The more experience of life in a broken world you had, I think the more Ecclesiastes resonates. And you see, this is true. It's not the last word. There is more to be said. We'll cover that today and in the morning. But it is true what he is saying. Right, yeah, this is the first place we have my son, which we've seen all over in Proverbs. This is the first place it crops up. It's impossible to answer the question exactly who's writing this. I tend to think that, yes, it is an editor after the fact who has brought the message of Kohelet, all that we've read in the I saw, that language, and has put it together with the introduction, but not to contradict Kohelet, but to say these are wise words from one shepherd, and to set it in the wisdom tradition by saying this also is something that I am imparting to my son. In the same way that Proverbs is making the son wise by saying, hear this advice, here, receive this word. I think that's what's going on here. In light of that, what do you think is the meaning of the end of verse 12? Of making many books, there is no end. Is he saying nobody should be a writer anymore? Stop writing books? I think the best way to read it is of the making of many books beyond this book. In other words, beyond this inspired book given by one shepherd. To interpret that, to try to explain life without submitting to this book will bring weariness to the flesh. There's not some other insight, some other knowledge. You can think of the theme, from the New Testament and later of secret knowledge, Gnostic knowledge. I think this verse is saying there's not some other secret that Kohelet hasn't considered, that you have not read in this, that will change everything about this. And if you give your life trying to find that kind of escape from the world that he's described, it will be much weariness. Instead, receive this book. Receive it not just as the words of a wise man, but as given by the one shepherd. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think the Gospels present Jesus as both the embodiment of wisdom and the perfectly wise teacher who shepherds his people by speaking words of wisdom to them. I think that's exactly right. In fact, one man, a guy writing a biblical theology, I can't remember, I was almost going to give this to you, and I can't remember if I did or not. The guy's name is Graham Goldsworthy. If you come across that name somewhere, he's a good biblical theology writer. He says that maybe even in addition to saying that Jesus is the prophet, priest, and king, we could also say he's the ultimate sage. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the Gospels use that category. They seem to be, in the way they're portraying Jesus as the teacher, the one who uses parables and Proverbs, like we said, wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove. Those kinds of things. He is the ultimate wise man, and the epistles tell us he is the embodiment of God's wisdom in human form. So then reading Ecclesiastes in light of that, again, like we said with Proverbs, it doesn't mean that now we don't need this book. It means now that ultimately we see this as a book given in light of Christ to help us understand and live in the present age as we wait for the coming age. So we'll talk about that when we get to our Christ-centered reading. There's ways of thinking about how Ecclesiastes points to the gospel that think of it as sort of a, well, what Ecclesiastes said was then, this is now, we don't have to deal with this. I think that's the wrong way. It is a more nuanced. He is describing life under Adam. There is more than life under Adam for Christians to experience because we bear the image of the second Adam, the last Adam. But we still live in the world that is groaning and under this judgment. And so Ecclesiastes is a gift to us from the one shepherd. It's interesting, too, this is the last time that a gift is spoken of in Ecclesiastes. That theme we've been tracing, a grievous business, the gift of joy, the power to enjoy that joy. Here's the last one. It's this book. All right, so in light of that, how would you summarize the ending of the book, 13 and 14? What's he saying? Again, if we're going to read this as a contrast with what's gone before, a contradiction, doesn't that seem like a summary of what Kohelet has been teaching us all along? And what are the reasons he gives? He gives 2 reasons, 2 clauses marked by 4. What are the 2 reasons? We should fear God and keep his commandments. 4, and then another 4. What are those reasons?
Because this is the duty of men.
Yep. Which is, I think I have this there, Kidner says, it's actually a little more vague than that. It actually literally says, this is all of man. Duty is a good summary, but more than just saying, here's something you should do, that's a part of your life, do your duty, and then there are other things. This is the whole of what it means to be a creature made in the image of God. This is the whole. This is what we're after. And then what's the other one? How does that confirm, and how does that end this book? Why does everything matter by the time we get to the end of the book? Does it matter because we can guarantee our control over it, our ability to predict what's going to happen? Or does it matter for a different reason? Go back to that example I was using earlier when we talked about sermon prep. Just as one little slice of how this applies. My hard work on Friday leading up to the sermon matters, not because I know what Saturday or Sunday will bring. For chapter 11, you do not know what will happen next. My working hard matters because that is what God has commanded me to do as an expression of obedience and faith in him. And one day he will bring how I lived on Friday and Saturday and Sunday and every day into light and before judgment. One commentator, let me find this. It's on page 21. This is again Derek Kidner. He talks about that image. He said this last picture of judgment is like a rock. He said, on this rock of judgment, we can be destroyed, but it is a rock, not quicksand. There is a chance to build. Isn't that a beautiful line? What he means is it's a sobering thing to know that everything we do will be brought to judgment, brought to light before the Lord. But that's a very different foundation than the quicksand of nothing matters. This is a rock. We can build on this. There is purpose to life because God will bring us to the day when he tests us, judges us, and commends and rewards us. Does that make sense? I want you to have that phrase in your mind. We can be destroyed here, but this is a rock. This is not quicksand. This is not a purposeless life. Do you see how we said earlier there's a movement from self-importance, I matter, to maybe nothing matters, to everything matters. But it matters because we will stand before God and give an account. And that is a solid ground to stand. You can't help but think of the Sermon on the Mount. That's a foundation we can build on, not sand, but a foundation that will endure the storm of judgment. And that's how the book ends. Incidentally, I think the reason that he says the end of the matter, all has been heard, is to summarize and remind us, Kohelet didn't forget anything. You couldn't stand there and say, wait a minute, you didn't think about this part of life. He has forced us to walk all the way around what it means to live in this kind of world, confronting the places where it's hard, it's painful to think, my life is fragile and will end. I could give my life to something, and in the end of my life, in this world, that be completely lost. But now we get to the end and we can say with the author, the end of the matter. All really has been heard. This is the whole duty of man. Fear God and keep His commandments. And that matters. That's a profound place to end this book, isn't it? That's why I love Ecclesiastes so much, that you can stand on that ground. In a world in which the person who calls you to ministry can blow up his ministry. In a world in which you can give your life to a church and that church fire you and turn away from the gospel you preached. Life still has a purpose because we live before the face of God. And He has called us to fear Him and keep His commandments. And as we do that, remember this is the book that also commends joy. Not a slavish fear, oh, I am terrified of that last day, but a faithful knowing our place. I will work hard. I will do what the Lord has called me to do. I will enjoy the way He sustains me through this life. And in the end, it will all matter. That's a secure place to be a pastor. That's a secure place to live the Christian life. All right, that's a lot. Thoughts, reflections on that. We've worked our way through the book. I think so. There's less about the future rewards. It is more a book making sure that we don't think, hey, the glory comes now, and I'm wise, I have some insight, I'm going to get it. The way I put it is this. Ecclesiastes says the whole duty of man is to fear the Lord and keep His commandments. It doesn't sketch that much of a picture of where fearing the Lord and keeping His commandments will take us. There is more that has to be said about the future glory that is coming. But there is not less to be said than what Ecclesiastes has said. We won't experience that future glory by doing something other than fearing the Lord and keeping His commandments. It sort of hints at it in the prospect of joy and life and light, which it commends. We didn't reference this, but it's just a great phrase in 11:7. Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see sun. There's a commendation of the good things of this creation, but before the full revelation of resurrection life, death is the shadow that's cast over all of Ecclesiastes. You don't escape death, so Ecclesiastes is trying to tell you how you must live in a world in which you will die. Think of what Paul says in 2 Timothy, I think it's 1. Christ is the one who brought life and immortality to light by His gospel. So we know so much more than Ecclesiastes about that future glory, but we don't build on a different foundation than Ecclesiastes. There is more to be built, but it won't happen in any other path other than fearing the Lord and keeping His commandments. Does that make sense? So that's where I push back and argue against the commentators who want to say, Ecclesiastes was then, now in the gospel of Christ, we have something different. No, we have more. We have much fuller revelation of how our work matters in the coming glory, but we don't build on any other foundation than fear the Lord and keep His commandments. And as you do that, the gospel unfolds how sinners can be forgiven of the times we don't do that, and then where that destiny is leading us to future glory in which the whole creation will participate in the glory of the revealing of the sons of God. So Ecclesiastes doesn't spell much out about that, but it makes sure we don't try to build on some other foundation. Have you all ever seen, I don't know if this is a cultural reference that'll make sense. Do you know what like needlework, tapestry kind of artwork where it's threads that are woven to have a picture on one side, but on the back you just make knots in the picture. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, well this illustration won't work very well then. It's a way of doing, a tapestry, like a picture made out of cloth and thread. It's like a big banner. When you look at that from the front and the back, they're very different pictures. Because on the back, you just have to tie the knot to make the thread hold its place. But from the front, you can see the whole picture. One man gave the illustration that all of life is like we're seeing it from the backside now. The beauty will be revealed on the other side. The way in which it all fits together and all makes sense and all leads us to praise the glory of our God. But right now, we don't get to see that. We get glimpses of it. We see the ways that God works and brings salvation into sinners' hearts and brings good in the right timing. But we also see along with that things that don't seem to make sense. So if we're trying to explain it all from underneath, from the backside of the tapestry, it's not beautiful. But Ecclesiastes tells us it will be beautiful. It just doesn't really pick up on that. But I think you're right. I think that's a hint of the coming glory, that Hevel is not the last word. But you cannot experience that beauty and glory unless you accept what Ecclesiastes is saying. But that's a good, if I were to pick a text that's probably the best summary of, or the pointer towards future glory, that's probably the one. Because there will be a beauty to this. If we want to ask, what does fear God and keep His commandments look like? It looks like daily dependence upon Him. In light not only of Ecclesiastes, but in light of the fact that I know He is good and trustworthy, because when I was a sinner, Christ died for me. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? I mean, in one sense, part of what Ecclesiastes is saying is you can't answer the question as though that the problem of life were a riddle that we can solve, like a mathematical equation. It's the end of this, you and I really have to depend upon the Lord and have a vital, living relationship with Him. A relationship of submission and awe and obedience and trust, because He's good and He's worthy of our trust. And apart from that, we won't be able to understand life. And that's not something you get once, check it off, and for the rest of your life. That's a daily walk. Other thoughts, questions? It's so important. That's how Ecclesiastes pastors us. I think let's wrap it up there. Here's what we'll do tomorrow. We'll begin by talking about one key way. We've already hinted at it, but one key way that Ecclesiastes connects to the gospel. And then we can just from that talk about, all right, where do you and I need this as pastors? How can we use this to minister to others?